Hey, my name is Nathaniel Fawson. I'm an archaeologist, and this channel is dedicated to the archaeology of North America, especially the region that we call the Eastern Woodlands. This weekend, the archaeology world had kind of two major events. The first was the 89th meeting of the Society for American Archaeology, which I attended. And the second was a debate between archaeologist Flint Dibble and Graham Hancock, who created the Ancient Apocalypse series on Netflix, hosted by Joe Rogan. So I'm going to talk about both of these. I'm going to start out with the SAA meeting, which, like I said, I actually went to. This is the program that was presented over the course of about 4 days. And obviously, I cannot make it to this amount of work. This is just the schedule. I cannot make it to this number of papers because they're all happening at the same time. But this is all kind of the state of the discipline research that's being presented. And this happens every year. We're getting updates on who's working on what, basically, and what their conclusions are. So the first thing that I went to was a full session on the Poverty Point site, which I've talked about on this channel before. I did an interview with Seth Grooms recently that talks a lot about the Poverty Point site and the cultures that surround it. So you can find a link to that interview down in the description for this video. So there were a few things. First, there was a pollen study that they're taking pollen cores from around the site. What they found was that the majority of the identifiable pollen was coming from tree taxa, which is usual, but only about 80% was coming from tree taxa, which is lower than normal. Usually in sites in this area at this time, it's more like 90%. And what this means is that the area around Poverty Point was wooded, but it was more open somehow. Either the canopy was more open, or there were more patches that had been denuded of trees. Either way, that means that the plant biodiversity in the area surrounding Poverty Point was higher than usual. And that also often means that the animal community surrounding Poverty Point was more higher diversity than usual, because there's more different kinds of environments and different resources for those animals to be able to use. And it's likely, we don't know this yet, but it is likely that this is not an accident, that people were deliberately modifying this landscape, because we know that the indigenous cultural ecology incorporated a strategy of landscape management in the Archaic period. They are encouraging plant species that they want to live around. They are discouraging tree species and things they don't want around, things that don't produce a lot of food, for instance. There was another paper on the macroscopic plant remains, not the pollens, remains like wood and nuts and seeds and these kinds of things. And what they found was that some of the plants that are found in the Eastern Agricultural Complex, those first domesticated plants, were found at Poverty Point. However, these plants are naturally present in that local environment. And from what the presenter talked about, they don't seem to have been the domesticated varieties yet. So it looks like one of two things. Either contact with people from the Ozarks, which we know Poverty Point had because of the material remains, geologic resources that are unique to the Ozarks, are found at Poverty Point. We know that those connections existed. So either the people who are coming down to Poverty Point from the Ozarks for pilgrimage reasons are bringing some of that food stuff with them, or, and I think that's the more likely of the two, it's also possible that when there, they kind of influenced some of the gardening practices that were happening in the area around Poverty Point. But like I say, if I were to, hazard a guess, and this is a guess, I would expect that we're really looking at a small-scale import of these plant materials, but I could be completely wrong about that. So, like I already said, both T.R. Kidder and his student Seth Grooms gave papers on kind of ritual intervention at Poverty Point and the construction of Jaketown. But most of that information was already covered in my interview with Seth Grooms. So you can go watch that to get a much more detailed kind of update on what's going on with that. News on the exotic material. There were geochemical studies that found that the galena plummets that were found at Poverty Point were chemically sourced to the southern Ozarks. And there was also a new chemical analysis of 9 copper objects from Poverty Point, and this found that 6 of those were from Minnesota, which, while the other sources were from either Appalachia or from the kind of eastern coast of Canada. The author of this particular paper, Mark Hill, seems to think that the Canadian and Appalachian sources are so similar to each other that they might be chemically confused for each other. We might not have high enough resolution. But the interesting thing is this contradicts what Hill found in his, I believe, 2016 research on the same subject using different copper artifacts. The first set of 6 did not source to the Great Lakes region. 6 from this group of 9 did. So we actually do have multiple sources of copper converging on this Poverty Point site in northern Louisiana, which is wild that they're getting copper from 2 radically disparate regions, and one of those regions is for certain as far away as Minnesota. So those are the big bullet points for the Poverty Point session. There was a session on theory in the southeastern U.S. I caught several of these, but the one that stuck out to me was a paper by an archaeologist named Maureen Meyer. She works at New South Associates. And in this paper, she developed a formal structural theory of household level microeconomics oriented around ideas like thrift and repurposing in southeastern indigenous households, and seemingly can be extrapolated out into other household regions, right? So hopefully she'll have a publication on that soon so I can summarize it properly. She was getting some really cool like internal household mechanics of how resources are used and reused, and some portions are saved for other intended purposes and things like that that were really, really cool, and I'd like to do a more in-depth kind of summary of that later. On Saturday, there was this full day session on experimental archaeology, but experimental archaeology as a teaching methodology. So instead of students strictly, reading and writing response papers and things, they're given clay and, stone to make stone tools. And one of the projects was there would be a communal class-wide end-of-class project where they would make a something, right? So like one of them was a wattle and daub replica charnel house, a burial house. And over the course of the semester, they have to learn to make all of the tools and materials necessary to build this house. So, how to make the cordage for tying and lashing the posts together. How to make the tools needed to cut the posts and shape them, and so on and so forth. And so by the time you get to the end of the semester, the students have developed this first line of technical skills that they need in order to make the materials that they will use to build this wattle and daub house. It's a really cool teaching technique, and it then provides a lot clearer understanding for the students of what they should expect to see on the ground when they're excavating a structure like this, a wattle and daub structure. There were similar papers on, teaching of the making of Southwest style food storage units. Once they had built them, they would have to draw the same kinds of sketch maps and plans and take the same kind of notes that we would take if we were to find one of these on an archaeological survey or excavation, and use so that by the time they've gotten done with this class, they've not only built the thing, they know how to document one when they find it. Really, really cool, innovative teaching methodologies that I think are going to have far-reaching impacts if they're implemented more broadly in the quality of field work that gets done from brand new field techs. Because I can tell you that the kind of period of training time that it takes on most techs fresh out of school to have the technical skills needed to really work on archaeological sites effectively and efficiently, it takes a lot of time. I generally say, 2 to 3 years, you'll kind of know what you're doing a little bit. There were some forums on what we call braided knowledge, kind of intertwining Western science with indigenous oral tradition and scientific knowledge, not formally recorded scientific knowledge, but certainly knowledge of the natural world and how to incorporate these things effectively, which was an indigenous run panel also. So that was cool to see. A lot of good stuff. You can go onto the SAA website and see the full program and kind of know what to look forward to in terms of what's going to be published in the coming years. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about, though, is the debate between Graham Hancock and Flint Dibble. This thing had all kinds of weird twists and turns to it, and if you haven't seen it yet, it is 4.5 hours long, but I do recommend watching it. It's very good. First, I want to say that Rogan did a really great job of officiating this discussion. He gave both discussants room to talk, but also kept them on task. He didn't really allow for a whole lot of bullying between the sides. There's a little bit, but not that much. And he also kind of shut down kind of divergences into what I'll call unproductive lines of evidence and discussion, things that really just aren't helping anything. So I start out. It's a great episode, and he did a phenomenal job. So the bulk of the discussion, at least early on, went something like this. Flint points out that Hancock's idea of a lost Ice Age civilization isn't a new idea. It's very old. It goes back at least to the 19th century. And if it existed, archaeologists by now should have found some evidence for it. Tangible, direct evidence, not stuff that happened, several thousand years after the Ice Age. In the Ice Age, there should be evidence that this civilization existed. But when we do excavate Ice Age sites, what we're finding is the residues of more ephemeral hunter-gatherer campsites at most, typically. And campsites are harder to find than towns. And towns are harder to find than cities. So if we're going and looking at these places all over the world, and we're finding campsites, but we're not finding cities, and we're not finding towns, then it's very hard to imagine that those cities and towns actually existed, because they should be the first things we find. They should be the most obvious things for us to find. Now, Hancock responds that archaeologists aren't looking in the right places. He makes this whole song and dance about how only 1% of the Sahara has actually been excavated, which sounds pretty damning, sure, until you recognize that 1% excavation is not the same thing as 1% survey. And survey of the area is much more extensive. You've got the satellite imagery and remote sensing techniques and LiDAR and things like that, but also boots on the ground, investigation of high probability areas like ancient lake shores that are now dry, or ancient stream beds, things like that, where if you're going to find large numbers of people, those sources of water are the first places to look. And we don't find evidence of these kinds of Ice Age civilizations where the water once was. He also brings up places like the Amazon and parts of islands off the coast of South Asia and things. But in each of these cases, Flint's main argument holds up. the evidence of these civilizations, or this civilization really, because Graham always has insisted it's one. They should be the first things we find. We should run into them on the way to the Ice Age hunter-gatherer sites, but we don't find them. And like I say, they should be really obvious, much easier to find by accident than the hunter-gatherer sites that we do find. Now, of course, we might stumble on something in the future. There's a statistical possibility. It's a non-zero chance. But at this point, we have such a wide net cast, and we have targeted so many specific places that for none of those sites to have ever produced evidence of this lost Ice Age civilization, which Hancock acknowledges we have not, it's pretty damning evidence. Graham also brings up his general beef with archaeologists shutting down anything that they don't like. So he brings up like how the pre-Clovis claims were dismissed and not taken seriously. And I will give him the Jacques Cinq-Mars scenario with Bluefish Caves. He did get quite a bit of backlash, and evidently did have some very substantive consequences to publishing that information. But there's two issues that I take with this being held up as a example of the norm in archaeology. At the very same time that Cinq-Mars was publishing on Bluefish Caves and getting dealing with the consequences of that, Adovasio was publishing material on the Meadowcroft. Well, he was excavating and publishing material on the Meadowcroft rock shelter, which had his Miller phase pre-Clovis tradition represented there. And people were very skeptical of it, rightly so. And there were all kinds of questions about how the material got into that part of the cave. Was it in place? Was it out of place? Did bioturbation, burrowing animals, something like that, drag these materials down into a new context? Were the dates taken on old carbon that don't actually go along with the lithic materials that he was finding? These kinds of questions. But Adovasio's methodologies were airtight, and he continued to work and publish with uninterrupted for years after that. And these two things are happening at about the same time. I don't know what the difference was. Maybe because Cinq-Mars was French and they didn't like that. But I mean, whatever it happened to be, that was not a normal response to strong evidence of pre-Clovis. And honestly, having read some of that back information, the new evidence for Bluefish Caves is pretty strong. It's pretty substantial. The stuff that was being published earlier wasn't quite, the cornbread wasn't baked all the way through, so to speak. The same kind of went with Yarnell down at Monte Verde. And I believe Flint brought this up too. Yes, there was a lot of pushback when Yarnell first published his findings at Monte Verde. Of course, the American archaeologists are going to be skeptical of some site that's 15,000 miles away from where all the other oldest sites were. It seemed really out of place and really weird. And so they were rightfully skeptical. But, you know, Yarnell held his ground and invited a group of archaeologists down to actually see the site. And he gave them all, site tour. They discussed the data, where it was coming from. And from what I understand, to a man, each individual archaeologist who went down to see that, to see Yarnell's site, came away convinced that actually was a 14,000+ archaeological site in the Americas. It took work to change their minds, but it's supposed to. These kinds of extraordinary claims are supposed to require extraordinary evidence for an expert to change their mind on it. Now, the last part of it that I really want to talk about is that about 2 hours in, something unexpected happened. Going into this, I was really concerned that Flint was going to make a whole spectacle out of Graham's use of 19th century Nordicist ideas, kind of these proto-National Socialist ideas that like Heinrich Himmler was really into. But instead, Graham picked this fight with Flint, which I did not see coming. So I think that Flint did a really good job of, under pressure, of explaining where this association is coming from. But just to summarize, when Graham uncritically uses and references these 19th century white supremacist writers like Ignatius Donnelly in his book on Atlantis as evidence for his hypothesis, he's validating the views of those writers. He's taking them seriously as though they should be taken as strong evidence. He is inserting himself into that history of racist rhetoric when he does these things uncritically. The problem wasn't that he was using those sources. That wasn't the issue. The problem was that he was using them irresponsibly. If he were to revisit those arguments and explain who those writers were and what their motives were and what parts of their arguments he still thinks might be useful and why he thinks these parts of the arguments still might hold up despite where those writers were coming from, then it wouldn't be the same thing. He would have a much stronger defense for using that kind of information. But when he refuses to accept that an uncritical application of books like Atlantis, the Antediluvian World from the 1800s, when he refuses to accept that that kind of literature serves to revive these 19th century and early 20th century beliefs from these white supremacist writers, it makes him willfully complicit in that problem. And that's the racist part, is that he's contributing to the issue rather than responsively confronting the issue. I could use, quotes from Mein Kampf or whatever if I wanted to, if I was able to properly contextualize where the information was coming from, what the writer was trying to do, and why that information still might be informative about something. And that's not what Hancock is doing. He is taking these writings from these white supremacist writers at face value and putting them back out into the public consciousness, which is the problem. All right, so that's pretty much all I have to say about that. I am more than happy to, read and respond to your comments down below. And as always, thank you for watching.